On the latest Sound Politics, protests against Trump's immigration policies and crackdowns on cities are ramping up in Seattle. But what is the right and effective way to protest? We'll talk to a liberal lawyer who went viral for yelling at Antifa this summer. Now he feels totally different. Hear it on Sound Politics wherever you get your podcasts.
The future of Seattle's highways affects all of us. I'm Ian Koss, host of the award-winning podcast, The Big Dig, and you can join me live as we explore what's next for Seattle's roads. It's October 27th at 7 p.m. at the Central Library in downtown Seattle. RSVP at kuow.org/events.
KUOW live events are sponsored by Finney Ridge Painting.
Seattleites aren't having kids like they used to.
Seattle ranks last when it comes to people having kids.
There's not a lot of kids in Seattle. In fact, I stood in the Ballard neighborhood for 15 minutes and only saw a handful pass by.
Seattle and Portland are wrestling for the title of the city with the lowest birth rate. But it's not just the Pacific Northwest. Birth rates are declining across the country.
America is heading towards a demographic cliff. The U.S. birth rate has trended downward since 2007 to a now historic low.
Environmentalists say there are benefits to slowing population growth, like less consumption and strain on resources. But economists start to worry when the birth rate dips well below the replacement rate. That's because it can mean slower economic growth and labor shortages down the road.
I'm Joshua McNichols.
I'm Monica Nicholsberg, and this is Booming. There are a lot of things driving down Seattle's birth rate, but the most obvious, it costs a lot to raise a family here. Today, what does it mean for Seattle's economy if people can't afford to have kids? That's coming up.
There's no way we could have a child now. Not with the market the way it is, no.
God, no, that just wouldn't make any sense.
So, Monica, what made you want to do a story about the birth rate? Why did you want to look into it?
Well, this is something I've been hearing about for a long time, and you kind of get two different perspectives on what a declining birth rate means for society. On the one hand, you have people saying that lower population could be good for the environment. There are a lot of us here, and we pollute, and we consume fossil fuels, and we eat lots of meat, especially in this country, and it is taking a real toll on the environment. But on the other hand, there are economic downsides to a declining birth rate. So I wanted to talk to an expert who could just help me understand how we should be thinking about this trend.
So who did you find?
I talked to Karen Benjamin Guzzo. She's a professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina, and she's the director of the Carolina Population Center. Her work focuses on fertility and childbearing attitudes and behaviors. Here's what she had to say. Karen, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So to start, I wonder if you could just help me understand what we really mean when we say low birth rate. How low is it in the U.S.?
So the common number we see in the media and in major reports is something called the total fertility rate. That is a hypothetical estimate of the number of children a woman will have over her lifetime if she has today's age-specific birth rates as she goes through her childbearing years. So it's a hypothetical estimate. But when you put those together right now, we are at a record low of about 1.6, a TFR, a total fertility rate of 1.6. And that is the lowest we've ever recorded in the United States. And the reason people sort of worry about this is that a TFR of 1.6 is lower than what is sometimes known as the replacement rate of fertility, which is around 2. That number gets misunderstood a lot. So if we're below that number, it doesn't actually mean we're about to imminently have population collapse. But it does. It's an interesting number to think about. If we're not replacing ourselves, well, goodness, what does that actually mean? So we're at this record low and have been consistently declining since the Great Recession.
So we know that the total fertility rate isn't available at the city level. That's the metric that you're using. But there are lots of ways to measure this. And in Seattle, the number of births per 1,000 women of childbearing age dropped by 20 points in the last 15 years. Nationally, the drop was only 5 points. Seattle and Portland have the lowest birth rates of all big U.S. cities. So what is it about the Pacific Northwest?
I think that's a great question. So what's happening, I think, in a lot of major cities, but particularly probably places like the Pacific Northwest, is you have a combination of a few different things. So you have issues like the cost of living, which is incredibly high in Seattle and in Portland. You also have a large number of young adults who are coming there either for college or post-college to work in the tech industry or the finance industry. And it's hard to maintain sort of a dating life and a social life and have kids and still work in those kind of jobs. You also have relatively low rates of marriage, and so that's part of it too. You have potentially more what you might think of as sort of people living non-traditional family lives. So people who are perhaps maybe not interested in having kids, but also maybe a larger share of people who aren't particularly religious. And we know religiosity is related to having kids. You have people who are more worried about the climate in that particular part of the country, and worries over what's happening with climate change are negatively associated with having kids. People who sort of fall outside of sort of a cisgender or sort of straight population tend to have kids at lower rates too. So you have a few different things going on there in the Pacific Northwest that might drive down birth rates. But it's also the case that when people are ready to have families, what they often do is they move somewhere else. They move to the suburbs. So you have kind of a selection issue of like who stays in the cities to try to raise kids. And people feel like they can't do that in a city. They move out to other parts of either that area or even to other parts of the country.
Yeah, I mean, I can attest firsthand to how expensive it is to try to raise a family here. But if it were just about the cost, you would expect San Francisco and New York to be top of the list, and then maybe Seattle and Portland would be somewhere in the top 5 mix. But it does seem like there's something cultural going on where there are also decisions that people here make not to have kids, and it's not only the sort of systemic issues we've been talking about. So what might be some of the economic implications of a low birth rate in a city like Seattle?
Well, one of the things people worry about is the tax base. So if your city isn't necessarily growing through natural increase by simply more people being born there, you worry about who's going to be in the city in the future. So for a city like Seattle and much of sort of the destination areas in the Pacific Northwest, you'll probably still have a pretty active tax base because it's such a destination. It's a beautiful place to live. It's so culturally rich. People will continue wanting to go there. But in some ways, I would say the problem is that people who want to have kids and feel like they can't, that's a downstream issue from larger problems. So eventually the fact that no one can afford to live in the Pacific Northwest as a young adult is going to catch up to a city like Portland, like Seattle. And so thinking about what, can people afford to raise families? Can people afford to make investments if you have a whole city of renters, for instance? Do people invest in their neighborhoods and their communities in the same way and build long-term businesses? Then you also face issues of sort of an aging population. So if there aren't any young adults coming in and there aren't any children being born, you start to have a mix of what kind of buildings and services do we need to offer? Fewer schools, more hospitals? Do we need more caretakers? Do we need more assisted living facilities? And who's going to work in those industries? So you start to see a shift of what the population needs are in some ways.
Are there other ways to solve some of those problems besides getting people to have more babies?
There are always better solutions than trying to get people to have more babies. It's one thing to say people want to have kids and feel like they can't. Like that's definitely something we should try to address. But having more babies is not a terribly effective way to help your economy or help address sort of shifts in the labor market, because every baby being born needs 20 years before they're going to be contributing to the labor market, 25 years. And babies and children are sort of net dependents. They are net burdens. They cost money to educate them and to build schools and so forth. So immigration would be a great way to prop up the economy and to bring in people of working age. And of course, we're seeing the exact opposite, at least at the national level, of sort of a pro-immigration society that's welcoming of things. We could also make changes to different types of policies where we, encourage people to have remote work, or we don't enforce return to office mandates so that people can continue to work. We know what happens when we force people to go back in the office is mothers leave the labor force, or they cut back on the types of work that they do. And then they are not producing as much, they're not contributing as much to the economy, and they're also less likely to be, improving their own economic fortunes and making long-term plans for their own futures.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly see that the current administration in the U.S. is taking more of a pro-natalist, anti-immigration approach to some of these problems. But I'm curious how much leverage a government really has here, because I always think about France. It's a country with very generous social policies for families, but their birth rate just hit a historic low, and it's been declining for years. Has any government managed to increase its birth rate?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, and one that I think gets ignored a lot, which is that once birth rates really fall, it is really hard to replace them. No one has ever been able to create a policy that has been able to improve and increase birth rates and sustain them. So what a lot of things do, the policies that have been tried, change the timing of it. So people might have kids a little bit earlier, or they might have their kids a little bit closer together, but they're not going to have, 3 kids instead of 2 if they had never intended to have 3 anyway. These policies rarely get people who have no interest in having kids to decide that they need to have not only 1 kid but 2 kids. So these policies, they tend not to work. So by investing and shifting monies to pro-natalist policies, it's really sort of throwing money away. What we probably need to do is make sure that the population that we do have is as healthy and productive as possible. And so that would mean making investments in things like childcare and making investments in paid leave. And those are not things that are really on the table right now for the current administration.
Yeah, and we should note here in Washington, there have been investments in paid family leave and in childcare subsidies for low-income families. And, like you said, we still have a pretty low birth rate. Are there benefits to that? Are there benefits to having a low birth rate?
Low birth rates do help communities plan better so they can anticipate what kind of needs they have. So in times of rapid growth, it is often difficult for communities to figure out, how to build enough housing, or what kind of school needs they have, or what kind of even roads and transportation systems they need. So slower rates of growth allow people to take a more longer-term view because they don't have to be reactionary all the time. And so this is helpful to think about, what do we really need and what do we want to prioritize?
Another argument that you hear for not having children is climate change. People worry that the future is uncertain and could be quite painful given the climate disasters that are becoming more frequent and more severe. And they say that we are struggling to support the population that we already have. And it's a good thing that we reduce it a bit. And then there's this economic argument that a low birth rate means a declining workforce and means an aging population, and who's going to step up to take care of those people. It just has me wondering if it is possible to be environmentally sustainable and economically sustainable when it comes to population size at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so one of the concerns, I think, with the environment is I think increasingly a lot of people are on the fence about having kids. They would consider having kids, but they're thinking of different things. I don't think the environment is necessarily the number one reason. Like, I'm dying to be a mom and have 2 kids, but I'm not going to have any because of the environment. But I think when you're already on the fence, and being a parent is not compulsory anymore than it might have been, for prior generations. And so you're like, well, I want to have kids, but only if I think the world is not going to blow up, and if I think I can afford to, take some time off and be a stay-at-home parent for a little while, and if I thought I could return to my job later and still have a career, and if. And so I think things like the environment are just yet another thing that people are thinking of. So I think what happens a lot is people are like, I just don't know, and they just sort of put off that decision until the future. But if you put off having kids for 25 years, you end up not having any kids. And that's perfectly fine for a lot of people. They're like, yeah, I would have had kids but it never worked out. And that's okay, too.
Should Seattle's low birth rate worry us about its economic future?
I think Seattle on its own in some ways is always going to be drawing young adults and drawing tech and drawing, people who want to live in such a beautiful, culturally rich part of the area. What I do think, though, is that the fact that it's probably the case that there are people who wish they could have kids and can't, or wish they could have another kid and just can't see how it's at all possible with the cost of living and the cost of childcare. So in many ways, I think people not having kids is a downstream indicator of larger failures that we're making. So we're not making the workplace friendly enough for parents. We're not making housing friendly enough for parents. We're not addressing things that would make people feel more confident that having a kid right now or having a kid in the future is the right thing to do. So we're not making these sort of investments that are making people feel confident about the futures. Having people who can have their kids and raise their kids right in the city would be a way of sort of investing in the future of Seattle in ways that doesn't require you to keep attracting new people from outside constantly.
It sounds like you're saying it's not a problem economically or maybe even philosophically that fewer people are choosing to have kids, but it is a problem if people want to have kids and can't because of systemic failures.
Yeah, I think that's the issue. One of the things that my research has showed, and yes, most of my research is looking at national data, is that lots of people still are interested in having kids. The ideal family size is still around 2 kids. There's even some indication maybe people think 3 or more is better, but they feel like they can't do it. That gap between what you would have if the cards aligned for you and what you feel you're able to do signifies to me that we are sort of failing future generations by building a world where they can have the lives that they want. So I think we need to make sure that we're making a world where lots of people feel that having kids is not a risky endeavor.
Great. Well, Karen Benjamin Guzzo, this has been a really interesting conversation, and I appreciate you being here with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so this was really interesting. My biggest takeaway is that convincing more people to have babies who don't want to is not possible and won't solve this problem. So that makes me wonder, what do we do with this information?
Yeah, I think 2 things. Like you said, I think we need to accept that this is not a trend that's likely to be reversed. And maybe that means we need to redesign our safety net so that it doesn't depend on larger and larger populations of young people to support the older generation.
Yeah, like Social Security. I mean, it depends on demographic growth at the bottom of the pyramid to support the elders at the top of the pyramid. We could design these systems so they're not dependent on having more babies, though. Like right now, we only tax some of people's incomes up to a cap, but we could tax more wealth, like a capital gains tax, for example. So instead of taxing more people, you just tax more money.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all options could be on the table here, especially now that AI is raising this question of whether the future of wealth generation is even going to depend on population. Mm-hmm. Maybe robots will be making all the money.
Yeah.
And then the second thing I think we can do with this information is there are people who want to have kids, but they feel like they can't because of financial or environmental reasons. We could make changes so that they feel like they can have kids. If keeping the birth rate from dropping disastrously low is a priority for our society, then we need to be thinking about how we can remove some of those barriers from people who genuinely do want to have children.
Well, we're going to take a look at one idea to tackle the housing part of that problem next week.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear your reporting on it.
All right. Before we go, we've got an exciting reminder. Booming is going to have our first live event. Join me and the Big Dig podcast to explore the future of Seattle's highways and hear some experts making big decisions about what's next for our roads. That event will be October 27th at 7 p.m. at the Central Library in downtown Seattle. It's filling up fast, so make sure you grab your free ticket soon. You can RSVP at kuow.org/events.
Also, we have a question for you. Did you or somebody you know move to the Pacific Northwest because of climate change? Whether the motivation was an environmental disaster, rising insurance costs, or just general anxiety, we want to hear from you. Reach out to booming@kuow.org or leave us a voicemail at 888-221-7158, and you might be featured on a future episode.
Thank you to those of you who are donating to the show. We really appreciate it. And if you want to donate, you can go to kuow.org/booming. Thanks.
If you don't happen to listen with a pen in hand, you can find all those links in our show notes. Our producers are Lucy Suchek and Alec Cowan. Our editor is Carol Smith. I'm Monica Nicholsberg.
I'm Joshua McNichols.
And we'll see you next time.